Welcome back to our exploration of Judea Pearl's The Book of Why. Today we're diving into Chapter 2, Prepare by Amir Rafai,
It's all about the history of causal inference.
really exploring how statisticians grappled with the whole correlation versus causation problem.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story of how this crucial field kind of went through a phase of almost rejecting the idea of causation altogether.
They're just fixated on correlation.
Exactly. And you know what they say? Correlation.
Doesn't equal causation.
Right. And our story starts with Francis Galton back in 1877, presenting his famous quincunx at the Royal Institution.
Okay, I'm picturing a scene like a grand hall filled with these eager people. What exactly is a quincunx?
Well, you can think of it like a fancy Plinko board.
Okay, a Plinko board, but for science.
Exactly. So these balls bounce randomly through the pins, and what happens? They form a bell curve at the bottom.
Visually demonstrating the central limit theorem.
You got it. The central limit theorem, which basically says that even with random individual events, the overall outcome becomes predictable when you have a large number of them.
Which explains why things like height or intelligence often follow a bell curve in a population.
Right, exactly. And Galton was really into heredity.
So he saw this quincunx and thought, aha, this explains how traits are passed down.
Well, that's what he thought. He imagined the balls as genes and the pins as these random life events. But then, there was this puzzle. How do population traits remain stable over generations if it's all just random variation? Enter the concept of regression to the mean.
Okay, so for example, tall fathers tend to have taller sons, but not necessarily as tall as themselves.
Right. Things tend to average out over time. It's like, if you score amazingly high on a test one day, chances are you won't do quite as well the next time, even if you study the same amount.
So it's just things evening out.
Yeah, not some mysterious force pulling you down. And initially, Galton thought this regression to the mean was a causal process.
He was looking for a physical reason for his statistical phenomenon.
Exactly. And it's interesting how this tendency to look for these causal explanations, even when the answer might be purely statistical, kind of pops up again and again in this chapter. But what's really cool is that this whole misinterpretation actually led Galton to a major discovery.
What was that?
While he was comparing things like height and forearm length, he realized that even though they are correlated, neither causes the other.
Interesting. So that led him to abandon causal explanations for regression and embrace correlation as a way to just describe relationships.
Yeah. And that marked a crucial turning point in separating statistics from causation.
Okay, so he has Galton setting the stage with correlation, and then comes his disciple, Carl Pearson.
Oh yeah, Carl Pearson, who takes this whole correlation is king idea to a whole new level.
He was all in on correlation.
Completely. He embraced correlation and completely dismissed causation as even being a scientific concept.
Wow. Why?
He believes science should only describe observable patterns, not unseen causal processes.
Interesting. Where did that belief come from?
It stemmed from his positivist philosophy,
Okay.
which basically asserted that true knowledge comes solely from sensory experience.
So just focus on what and forget about why. Sounds a bit limiting.
It definitely had its limitations. But while this approach did have a big impact on how statistics develop,
It also steered the field away from developing a true science of causal inference.
you got it. But here's the irony. Pearson ended up exploring what he called spurious correlation.
Spurious correlation.
Correlations that are statistically significant, but they lack a real causal connection. Think like the classic example, ice cream sales and shark attacks.
Oh, right. Both going up in the summer. But one doesn't cause the other.
Exactly. Pearson found all these interesting examples, like a strong correlation between chocolate consumption per capita and the number of Nobel Prize winners in a country.
Okay, but obviously eating chocolate doesn't cause you to win a Nobel Prize.
Exactly. Just because you see a correlation doesn't mean there's a meaningful relationship, let alone a causal one. And that's something we still struggle with today. But here's the kicker.
What's that?
In his attempt to explain spurious correlation, Pearson actually had to resort to causal reasoning himself. Talk about a contradiction.
It really highlights the limitations of just relying on correlation.
Absolutely. And what's even more interesting is that he even stumbled upon something called Simpson's paradox.
Simpson's paradox, I've heard of that.
Yeah, where correlations can appear or disappear based on how the data is grouped.
It's like a mind-bending concept.
Yeah, it really is.
And something we'll definitely have to explore more later on.
Oh, absolutely. But, so Pearson kind of missed the boat on developing a full-fledged science of causal inference, right? But But then comes Sewell Wright.
Sewell Wright.
Yeah, who revolutionized the field with his work on genetics and his groundbreaking idea of path diagrams.
Path diagrams.
Yep. But first, let's talk about Wright himself. His story is full of surprises.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, he had this unconventional education, but his work ended up having a huge impact on both genetics and causal inference.
Interesting. So where did it all begin?
It all started with a rather adorable subject, guinea pigs.
Guinea pigs. Okay, now this is getting interesting.
He was studying the inheritance of coat color in guinea pigs and ran into a problem.
What was that?
The traits weren't behaving according to those simple Mendelian genetics.
Interesting. So it wasn't just about the genes themselves.
Right. He realized that factors beyond just heredity, like developmental factors in the womb, were playing a role too.
So it wasn't just the genes, but also their environment and how they were expressed.
You got it. So to figure out the relative importance of all these different factors, he developed what are called path diagrams.
Okay, so path diagrams
Are visual representations of causal relationships.
I'm imagining something like a flowchart with arrows connecting different factors.
Yeah, that's a good way to visualize it. So the arrows connect these variables, and the coefficients on the arrows, those indicate the strength of each causal link.
So it's not just showing connections, but also how strong those connections are.
Right. And what makes path diagrams revolutionary is that they were the first tool to really connect causation and probability in this formal way.
I see.
So Wright could use them to estimate the relative importance of these different causes, even if those causes weren't directly measurable.
So like with the guinea pigs, he could figure out how much those developmental factors, which you can't directly measure, were influencing coat color.
Exactly. And it was such a brilliant insight.
So using these path diagrams, he could actually peek into the hidden world of causal processes just by analyzing patterns in the data.
Yeah, exactly. And get this. He even discovered that those developmental factors were more important than heredity in determining coat color variation.
Wow, that's really going against the grain of traditional thinking at the time.
Totally. But I'm guessing his ideas probably weren't embraced by everyone right away.
Probably not. Scientists can be pretty resistant to change.
You're telling me. Unfortunately, no. His work was met with strong resistance from, the statistical establishment, particularly the followers of Pearson.
So they were stuck in their ways.
Yeah, they couldn't grasp this idea of incorporating subjective causal knowledge into their statistical analysis.
They just wanted to stick with pure observation.
Pretty much. But Wright was essentially saying, look, I can answer these questions that your correlation-only approach just can't answer. It's like agreeing on the rules of a game and then playing fair to see the results. This tension between objectivity and subjectivity in causal inference is really a key theme in this chapter and highlights what makes studying causation so challenging.
It's interesting how that same tension comes up in Bayesian statistics too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Both Bayesian and causal inference allow for this element of subjectivity, which was and still is controversial for some scientists.
Those who are clinging to that ideal of a purely objective science.
Exactly. But isn't it more honest to acknowledge that we have these pre-existing beliefs?
And then use a rigorous method to test them against data. And both Bayesian and causal inference offer such methods.
I think so too. However, even though both are comfortable with subjectivity, they speak different languages,
In what way?
Well, Bayesians operate within the framework of probability, while causal inference needs a richer language, like those diagrams, to really express those causal assumptions.
So even though they're both okay with subjectivity, they haven't quite figured out how to communicate effectively with each other.
Yeah. And, that communication gap might be one of the reasons why causal inference still struggles to find its place in mainstream science.
That's so interesting because it seems like such a fundamental concept, causality. Why would it be so controversial in science?
It is strange, isn't it? And this whole journey from Galton to Wright is really about the struggle between wanting a purely objective science and accepting that subjective judgments are kind of inevitable, especially when we're dealing with causation.
Because we're trying to understand the why behind things.
Exactly. It's this tension between letting the data speak for itself and realizing that we need a framework, a model, to make sense of it.
And that model inevitably comes from us, from our understanding of the world, which of course is influenced by our own experiences and biases.
So you got it. It can be tough for some to accept,
But like we saw with Bayesian statistics, embracing that subjectivity, as long as it's done carefully and transparently, can actually lead to more powerful and accurate conclusions.
You're absolutely right. And, Wright's story really shows us that.
And you mentioned before that he used these path diagrams to study the relationship between a guinea pig's birth weight and its time in the womb.
Yeah.
Seems like a pretty straightforward relationship on the surface.
Yeah.
How did he use path diagrams for that?
Well, he wanted to know, how much does a guinea pig's birth weight increase for every extra day it spends in the womb? Seems simple, right?
Yeah, totally. Just track gestation times and birth weights. What's so complicated about that?
Well, there's a bit more to it than that. You can't just look at the raw correlation.
Why not?
Because other factors are involved. For example, litter size.
Litter size.
Yeah. It influences both the length of gestation and the pup's growth rate. Larger litters usually mean shorter gestation periods and slower growth because those resources are spread thinner,
Right, because there are more mouths to feed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you just compare these pups born a day apart, you're not really isolating the effect of just gestation time.
You're mixing it up with the effects of litter size.
And potentially other factors too.
Right, so like those spurious correlations Pearson was talking about, the raw data might show a relationship, but it doesn't tell the whole story.
Exactly. You got to untangle those threads to get to the real causal effect.
Okay, so how did Wright manage to do that?
Path diagrams to the rescue.
Okay, so walk me through this. How can a diagram do all that?
Okay, so he starts by laying out all these relevant variables and how they're causally related, right? So we've got birth weight as the effect we're interested in.
Okay.
Gestation time and growth rate as direct causes. Litter size influencing both of those.
Got it. And then other factors like genetics and the environment all playing a role.
So he's essentially building a model of the whole system.
That's it. And here's where it gets really cool.
Yeah.
Those numbers on the arrows, those path coefficients, they represent the strength of each causal link.
Okay.
So you can actually use the diagram to calculate the total correlation between gestation time and birth weight.
Right.
And then, get this, subtract the portion of that correlation that's due to that indirect path, through litter size.
So it's like taking a detour, and the diagram helps you figure out how much longer that detour is making your trip.
That's a great analogy. By subtracting that detour's length, you're left with the direct effect of gestation time.
So you're isolating the effect you're actually interested in. Clever.
Right. And Wright found that for each extra day in the womb, a guinea pig's birth weight increased by about 3.34 grams,
Okay.
which is different from that 5.66 grams you would get if you just looked at the raw data.
Wow. So that's a pretty big difference. It really shows how important it is to consider those indirect paths. Totally. And this example highlights two key lessons.
Lay 'em on me.
First, causal analysis allows us to actually quantify these real-world processes.
Not just the patterns in the data.
Right. We're actually learning something about how these guinea pigs grow, not just how their gestation times and birth weights are, statistically related.
It's like the difference between looking at a map and actually understanding the terrain. You're not just seeing the lines, but you're understanding the real lay of the land.
A perfect analogy. And the second lesson is that in path analysis, you really have to look at the whole picture, not just isolated pairs of variables.
Right. You have to see the forest for the trees.
Exactly. And this brings us back to Wright's frustration with this model-free approach that was so popular in statistics back then. He knew that you just couldn't answer causal questions without a model of those causal processes involved.
It's like trying to solve a crime without considering any suspects.
Yeah. You might find clues, but you're never going to crack the case.
Exactly. So Wright was really ahead of his time in recognizing that you need a model to understand causation.
Absolutely. But as we've seen, it was a long and tough road to get those ideas accepted. It's amazing that something as fundamental as causality could be so controversial in science.
It is, right. And it seems like that resistance wasn't just about the methods themselves, but about this deep-seated belief in objectivity as the be-all and end-all of science.
Totally. And that brings us back to that link with Bayesian statistics, right? Both approaches kind of acknowledge that subjectivity is unavoidable, especially when we're dealing with uncertainty.
Because we never have complete information.
Right. But as we discussed earlier, they haven't quite figured out how to, speak the same language.
Even though they're both comfortable with some degree of subjectivity, they're approaching it from different angles.
Exactly. And I think this gets to the heart of what makes causal inference so challenging. Even if we all agree on the causal model, our interpretations of the data can still be different.
Because there's always going to be some uncertainty about the true nature of those relationships.
That's right. And, that uncertainty can be unsettling for some who really hold on to that idea of a purely objective science.
Challenges the very foundation of how they view science.
Exactly. It forces us to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge and the role of human judgment in shaping how we understand the world.
But isn't that part of what makes science so fascinating? We're constantly refining our models, testing our assumptions, getting closer to the truth, even if we might never fully reach it.
I completely agree. And Wright's story is so inspiring because of that. He had the courage to challenge the status quo.
And fight for the importance of causal thinking, even when everyone was doubting him.
Yeah, he was like a lone voice in the wilderness.
But thankfully, that voice was eventually heard.
Yeah. And even though path analysis had its ups and downs, its influence is everywhere today. You see it in genetics, epidemiology, economics, social science, all these fields.
It's a testament to the power of his ideas.
Totally. And it's a reminder that we have to be bold in our thinking, you know? Embrace the complexities of causal inference and always ask why, even when the answer isn't easy to find.
So in a way, the quest to understand causation continues.
Oh, absolutely. It's an ongoing journey. And with these insights from these early pioneers, we're definitely better equipped than ever to face those challenges. It's pretty amazing how they were wrestling with these ideas so long ago.
It really shows you how tricky it can be to figure out cause and effect.
Yeah, definitely. So as we wrap up this chapter,
What are some of the big takeaways for our listeners?
well, I think one of the most important points is that when it comes to causation,
You can't just rely on the data alone.
you got it. We need some kind of framework or model.
To make sense of those patterns,
Exactly. And that model ultimately has to come from us,
from our understanding of how the world works.
which means subjectivity is going to be part of the picture.
And that could be a tough pill to swallow for some scientists.
I know, right? But like we've been saying,
Embracing that subjectivity in a careful and transparent way can actually lead to more meaningful insights
absolutely. It's all about finding that balance
between relying on our knowledge and letting the data guide us,
and always being open to revising our beliefs based on new evidence.
because it's an ongoing process.
It is. It's not about finding that one perfect answer.
It's about constantly trying to understand the world better.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So for all our listeners out there,
Don't be afraid to ask why.
think about those underlying causal mechanisms.
And use tools like those path diagrams to make sense of those complex relationships.
And remember, even though a little bit of informed subjectivity is okay,
We still need to think critically,
oh, absolutely.
always testing our assumptions and being open to new evidence.
Couldn't agree more. It's a journey.
It really is. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Chapter 2 of the Book of Why by Judea Pearl, prepared by Amir Rafi.
It's been quite a journey,
Yeah, exploring the history of causal inference and all the challenges these pioneers faced.
but their work is still so relevant today.
Absolutely. Thanks to everyone for joining us on this exploration.
We hope you enjoyed it.
And be sure to tune in next time as we continue our journey through the Book of Why.